I'm so happy you came out. It's a nice night, and it's a good night for talking about John Fante and LA stories. So if this is your first time, or even if you just forgot, I want to remind you that what we're doing here is we're trying to understand this city, this unreal city, this city that is west of the West, as Teddy Roosevelt called it. And we can't. And that's okay. It makes us want to do that even more. And so I think, like the city, what we do is we overinterpret, or we celebrate the multivalency of the city. And so we have 10 visions of Los Angeles that we're doing in this series. And I'll tell you a secret, this is going to be my favorite. Well, you know, they're all favorites, but I think John Fante is, Ask the Dust is the LA novel. That's where I'm going to plant my flag. There are others, Nathaniel West's Day of the Locust, sure. Plenty of others, but for me, this is it. I hope maybe you'll see why tonight. Let's learn a little bit about John Fante. There are his dates. April 8th, 1909 to May 8th, 1983. Well, let's just get right into it. Let's hear his voice here. My father was very happy at my birth, he writes to H.L. Mencken, a name that's come up before, and you should know if you don't, great satirical writer and journalist. He continues in his letter to Mencken, he was so happy, my father was so happy that he got drunk and stayed that way for a week. On and off for the last 21 years, he has continued to celebrate my birthday. Right? From the beginning, right? Mother, Fante was born in Denver and spent a lot of time in Colorado, 1909. Hard drinking, obviously, Italian immigrant father, as we've already seen, but who gets paired with those kinds of men? A timid, deeply religious mother, right? Sometimes that happens. So he was born into this dichotomy, this unresolvable conflict between this hard-drinking man and this very boisterous man, and this timid, deeply religious mother. And then, you know, throw in some poverty, and you've got the makings of a writer there, I'd say. Poverty and prejudice against his Italian heritage. Let's see. Oh, right. This is, he has this line about his parents that, let me just read it. He's talking about his parents. I think this is in a letter. And he says, I pictured them lying there in the darkness of different worlds, sharing the same manger, like a burrow and a hen. Okay. Do you know the poet Sharon Olds?
Oh, she's fantastic.
She's fantastic. She has a poem, this just reminds me of this, called I Go Back to May 1937. Where she tries to keep her parents from getting together. She imagines them meeting on a college campus, and the lines in the poem are like, no, he's wrong for you. No, she's gonna kill you. Don't do it. So his break, he moves to Los Angeles in 1929, and he has a big break in that H.L. Mencken publishes one of his short stories, a little short story called Altar Boy, in a magazine called The American Mercury, which Mencken edited and published a lot of LA writers at the beginning. So that's his thing, and that's going to come up. We'll see it again. And then in 1937, I always like to include the women, especially in the male writers' lives, because you know they're there. And this was Joyce Smart, who becomes Joyce Fante, Stanford-educated poet and editor, without whom John Fante would not be known to us. So we saw last week with Fitzgerald's women, the women in his life, including Zelda, without whom we wouldn't know him. She was her husband's fiercest defender and advocate, and you're actually going to hear from her in a little bit. Tell a story about John. He does have a terrible time at the end of his life with just a little dash of redemption that, again, I want to show you toward the end. But Joyce was with him there. He called this period of his life Fante's Inferno. And it's because he was diagnosed with diabetes and he lost both legs and became blind. Thank the goddess for Joyce, again, who saved his life. See, I shouldn't try to do fancy. There it is. Okay. Nothing like Chandler or Fitzgerald, but still respectful oeuvre there from Fante. So, he was friends with Sinclair Lewis and H.L. Mencken, like I said, very important figures in American history, especially Sinclair Lewis. Ask the Dust is the one we're going to get into. Emily baked the cookies for. Yeah. That's all you brought? Okay. Because I have to be up here and, Okay. So his relationship with Mencken is, I don't want to overdo this, but it's kind of a father-son relationship, and you'll see what Mencken meant to him, which doesn't mean he didn't mock him mercilessly. In fact, that may have been a kind of affection, Fante's affection. So he writes Mencken a letter, and he says this to Mencken, H.L. Mencken, the most important man of letters in the early 20th century, that he's going to replace him as editor of the American Mercury. The only hitch in the plan, Fante writes, is that should you ever decide to quit the job, the magazine is liable to go on the rocks. So for God's sake, stick around a little bit longer, put your rubbers on and button up your overcoat. So that was Fante, right? This kind of outlandish hubris that's really fueled by affection and respect. We're going to see that over and over again. So Ask the Dust is the novel we're going to get into tonight. It's Fante. The character's name is Arturo Bandini, but it's Fante. And we saw this with Fitzgerald last time, that the veil between their real lives and their fictional characters is pretty thin. And that's okay. That's kind of cool. In Ask the Dust, he has published a little short story, just as Fante did, in a well-known journal, and he arrives in Los Angeles with two suitcases. One has his clothes and the other has copies of this little short story, copies of the American Mercury. So he's carrying around these copies of this one little short story, okay, and he's proclaiming his arrival in Los Angeles with this. And we've got Nathaniel West, we've got Steinbeck, we've got Chandler, we've got a few other writers in Los Angeles, but this is Arturo Bandini, and here I am with a short story called The Little Dog Laughed. Bandini says, it's a story to make you die holding the page, and it wasn't about a dog either. Okay. Right, so you know what he has to do for money, right? We've seen this before. He has to do screenwriting, which he despised, but he was good enough at it to make a living. So remember last time with Fitzgerald, they put these great writers with these production writers, and production writers know how to make a film. these novelists like Faulkner and Fitzgerald, Mailer and others, they want to create these worlds. Well, the world's already created. The director's doing that. We just need some dialogue from you maybe, or, paint a scene or something. This is how Fante describes that transition that he's unable to make, or makes with great difficulty. So he turns in his screenwriting work, and again, big vision, novel, and then he gets it back from these production writers, and he says, I was down the first page halfway when my hair began to stiffen. In the middle of the second page, I was forced to put the script away and hang on to the porch banister. Okay. Not dramatic at all, John. Thank you. Yes. He did work on an Orson Welles film, It's All True. He has a few screen credits, but he's a writer in a writer's room, so he's making a little money, which enables him to do the writing that he loves. And he's doing okay. He says this: those were the fat carnal days of the scribbler, and money was piling up, with Thursday coming once a week, bringing my agent full of wit and camaraderie, and what was left after he and the government cut up the Paramount check. He, of course, hated himself for being successful as a screenwriter. He writes to his friend William Saroyan, an accomplished writer, Armenian writer in his own right. I'm now a complete and ungarnished hack, he wrote. The wild, carefree author filling his days with exquisite sensuality. And he was writing about going to the grocery store. He writes a novel called, a humorous novel called Full of Life. So he can be playful and less dark than he is in his other works. Yes. Okay, so like many great writers and many not so great writers, he suffers from writer's block. And he says this. He sits down to his typewriter. He's got writer's block. Blows on his fingers, begins to type, and out comes The Walrus and the Carpenter, which is from Lewis Carroll. So he's writing what he remembers from Lewis Carroll, and he's like, what the hell, they weren't my words, but at least I had a start. So this is Ask the Dust, the novel that I think is the essential Los Angeles novel. And I don't say that lightly, because we've already talked about some amazing novels. And James M. Cain does some brilliant work describing the city. But for this novel, Ask the Dust, the city is a character, and unlike other novels, it's a full, rounded character. Los Angeles is in Ask the Dust, and you'll see how as we go through it. So we begin at the Hotel Alta Loma, and this is Bunker Hill in the 30s. So I know many of you don't go downtown or anywhere besides your immediate neighborhood, but we used to live downtown. We used to live on Bunker Hill, and I came to love it and learn a lot about it. And you should know that Bunker Hill in the early 20th century was full of these great Victorian houses, just because it was the place to be. In the late 19th century, Los Angeles was a small western town, basically 1875 or so, and didn't have a railroad or anything. And there was Bunker Hill. Now, you know what I'm talking about, right? The hill downtown, okay. And nobody was there. There were no houses there. Nothing was on this hill because you couldn't get water up there. You couldn't get electricity up there. So there was a man, a Canadian, named Prudent Beaudry, who said to the city, I'll buy that hill, And they said, great, it's yours. He's like, well, I'm going to need some water and electricity. They're like, oh, we don't know how to do that. It's 1875. And says, all right, I'll do it. So he goes and taps the Los Angeles River, builds a powerhouse and a water generation plant, and pumps water up there and electricity. Now it's the place to be in Los Angeles, right? And so the rich go there. They build these massive, not massive, but they build these Victorian houses. And in the 30s, well, in the early 20th century, that was the place to be. But by the 30s, those rich people have now moved way out in the country, that is mid-Wilshire. And people are like, are you crazy? You're living down Wilshire Boulevard? Like, why are you way out there? But, you know, I guess that's what the rich do. They keep moving away from us. So what happens to a unique location on a hill with all these great Victorian houses? They become tenements, they become hotels, they become what we would call extended stay hotels. So you can come in there and stay for as little or as long as you like. So this is Alta Loma, the top of Bunker Hill. Where he's staying is, again, based on a real hotel. I think I have an image of it here coming up. And this was life in the 30s. And so from this setting of Bunker Hill, this is where noir was born. We're not doing Raymond Chandler because I wanted to save him for another time, but this is Raymond Chandler's detectives and characters. It's 1930s is Day of the Locusts, Nathaniel West's, but he's setting it in Hollywood. This is a really interesting time for Los Angeles. And Bunker Hill is an interesting place because the movie industry really starts to take off in the 30s, and they love Bunker Hill, right? Because you've got Angel's Flight, you've got the world's shortest railroad right there. You've got Grand Central Market. You've got all these old Victorian buildings and these old financial district buildings on Spring Street. It's a good place to film. And so this Bunker Hill of the 30s becomes Los Angeles because it's in film so much, right? Well, the Community Redevelopment Association decided that it was time to clear all those people out in the 50s, and I don't want to get into this too deep, but basically they level Bunker Hill. And that's not a metaphor. They leveled it. Bunker Hill of the 30s was 100 feet taller than what it is if you go downtown right now. So they literally flattened it in order to build those skyscrapers and to create a new financial district. And you can't build a good parking lot on a hill. So I know, cue Joni Mitchell, right? Not that it was paradise, but so completely just gone. And they tried to save a few of these Victorian houses. They moved them over to, I think it was 3 of them, they moved over to Heritage Square Park. I think 2 of them burned down. So there's 1 left. Maybe somebody's been there and knows. So that's a whole life of a city that's just erased. I mean, and the people are erased too. And that's why Norman Klein writes a book called The History of Forgetting, about the history of Los Angeles. We just forget. Anyway, John Fante did not forget. He memorialized this scene, this life on Bunker Hill in Ask the Dust. So right, he arrives at this hotel on Bunker Hill, tenement hotel basically. 2 suitcases, like I said. In the novel, it's the Atlantic Monthly, where he published this little short story, but he's got copies and copies of the Atlantic Monthly, that issue, that he's going to hand out to people. And he does. He hands one out to a girl in a bar. Like, okay, that's your move? All right, sure. And of course, he lets everyone in his little building know that he is Arturo Bandini, author of The Little Dog That Laughed. And they're like, okay. and so he will present them with an autographed copy of it. And they're like, okay, there's a great scene I'll read to you about this. The H.L. Mencken comes out in the novel as J.C. Hackmuth, which is kind of nice. He worships, Arturo Bandini worships Hackmuth, well, because he published his story, The Little Dog Laughed, and it's kind of ridiculous. What does he say here? He says in the novel, I'd stand before Hackmuth's picture, crying out of both eyes, telling him he picked a good one this time, a great one. Bandini, Arturo Bandini, me. He's such a wonderful character, so flawed, so full of shit, so broken. You're going to see. It's Ask the Dust, like I said, that I think is the Los Angeles novel, because I just don't see lyrical descriptions of Los Angeles like this. There are plenty of descriptions of Los Angeles that are cynical, and we've seen some of them, and we'll see more of them, and you know the genre, and that's fine. There's plenty to be cynical about here. But what I love is that Arturo Bandini is more cynical than anyone, and yet he loves this city. And, right? Maybe you're in touch with that feeling. So a lot of characters here, but none as important as Camila Lopez, whom you're going to hear a lot about. Camila works at the Columbia Bar. It's a place on Spring Street where Arturo goes, and she's a waitress there, and their first encounter's amazing. I think she brings him coffee, and he pours it out. Like, again, that's his move, is he's flirting, so he pours it out, and they get in a fight. Yes, Sutender, you had it.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you have an example of this lyrical?
Yeah, the rest of the lecture. Yeah. Thank you. That was a bit of a tease, wasn't it? Yeah. Okay. Oh, Camila. Mexican ancestry. She drives him crazy. He drives her crazy. It's the perfect love affair. She can't deal with him anymore, so she goes with the bartender, because of course she does, whose name is Sammy, and who is actually a writer. So it's like, the girl who always goes off with the drummer. So yeah, here we go. There's this. I should just stop talking and, like Sutender said, and let you hear some of this. But this is an amazing love affair. One of the great love affairs in fiction, I think, that people don't know about, because they despise each other, but they can't quit each other. And he's just horrible to her, and she's brutal to him, and they cannot stop being together. Listen to this. He's incredibly racist toward her. He's Italian, and she's Mexican. And this happens, right? Is you turn the immigrants against each other. I don't know if that has any relevance now, but you try to get them, right, and they can absorb it. Like, this happened in New York, in Ellis Island. Like, if you came to Ellis Island like 2 weeks after the other group, you didn't belong here, right? This is Arturo and Camila. He writes this: I stole glances at her. I was speechless, and I nodded and grinned. Good move. She stepped upon the blankets and asked me to move over. This is after they've gone swimming in Long Beach. I made a place, and she slipped under, her body sleek and cold. She asked me to hold her, and I held her, and she kissed me, her lips wet and cool. We lay a long time, and I was worried and afraid and without passion. What? Wait, did I read that right? We lay a long time, and I was worried and afraid and without passion. Okay, so that scene's not supposed to go like that. Listen to this. Something like a gray flower grew between us. A gray flower, right? A thought that took shape and spoke of the chasm that separated us. What are you talking about? You're naked under a blanket. What's separating you? Well, your head, of course, your history, your self-perception. I didn't know what it was, he writes. I felt her waiting. I drew my hands over her belly and legs, felt my own desire, searched foolishly for my passion, strained for it while she waited, rolled and tore my hair and begged for it. But there was none. There was none at all. Only the retreat to Hackmouth's letter. Hackmouth's letter. And thoughts that remained to be written, but no lust. Only fear of her and shame and humiliation. Then I was blaming and cursing myself, and I wanted to get up and walk into the sea. She felt my retreat. With a sneer, she sat up and began drying her hair on the blanket. "Thought you liked me," she said. I couldn't answer. I shrugged and stood up. We dressed and drove back to Los Angeles. We didn't speak. She lit a cigarette and looked at me strangely. Her lips pursed. She blew smoke from her cigarette into my face. I took the cigarette out of her mouth and threw it into the street. She lit another and inhaled languidly, amused and contemptuous. I hated her. Just right. That's one paragraph. And they go from about to have sex to him hating her. And there's this dominant symbol, which is the blackened palm outside his hotel room window. Let's see. So just listen, and this is Arturo, and this is his world. These grand ideas, again, not at all like LA, grand ideas about these grand stories and being a part of this grand story, but in fact the reality outside your window is different. Through that window I saw my first palm tree, not 6 feet away, and sure enough I thought of Palm Sunday. You're a Christ figure, Arturo? Okay. And Egypt. Okay, great. Cleopatra. Good for you. But the palm was blackish at its branches, stained by carbon monoxide coming out of the 3rd Street tunnel. Its crusted trunk choked with dust and sand that blew in from the Mojave and Santa Ana deserts. There it is. All right, so here's the lyrical descriptions of life in Los Angeles. One night I was sitting on my bed. This is the opening line, opening paragraph. One night I was sitting on my bed in my hotel room on Bunker Hill, down in the very middle of Los Angeles. It was an important night in my life because I had to make a decision about the hotel. Either I paid up or got out. That was what the note said. The note the landlady had put under my door. A great problem, deserving acute attention. I solved it by turning out the lights and going to bed. And then this is the most lyrical statement about Los Angeles in the entire book. And I love this because it's early in the novel, and he's woken up in his hotel room on Bunker Hill, and he walks down Bunker Hill, and he just goes over to Spring Street, and he walks around to the Biltmore, and he goes by Pershing Square, and he's like Walt Whitman almost. He's like celebrating everything and all the people and this great city, and he writes this, Los Angeles, give me some of you. Los Angeles, come to me the way I came to you. My feet over your streets, you pretty town. I loved you so much, you sad flower in the sand, you pretty town. There it is, the lyrical descriptions of Los Angeles. And how perfect for Arturo. He wants this to be that kind of place. And again, I don't know if any of you have come here wanting this to be a particular kind of place, but it won't let you do that, right? In fact, it'll break you before it lets you do that. But sometimes it gives you other gifts instead. There's the hotel. The hotel was called the Alta Loma. It was built on a hillside in reverse. And this is right, there on the crest of Bunker Hill, built against the decline of the hill, so that the main floor was on the level with the street, but the 10th floor was downstairs, right? So he comes here and everything's like quite literally upside down and backwards. If you had room 862, you got in the elevator and went down 8 floors. If you wanted to go down in the truck room, you didn't go down, but up to the attic, one floor above the main floor, yes. So there's Grand Central Market. When we came here in 2012, it was not unlike this. It is very much unlike this now. I actually met the 2 owners who have made it. Like there were these stands, and they were just fruit and produce, and it was incredibly cheap. And we used to live near there, so I'd walk over there and get stuff. And not long after 2012, when I moved here, a couple of years maybe, I walk over and then the stands are gradually being replaced. Now, they're not being replaced by their products. The products are the same. They're just much more expensive, right? And the people who are selling those products and produce and fruit aren't people of color anymore. And so it has been gentrified, I guess. I don't know. It's been made upscale, whatever. And there was a time you could go in there and get bread and just get bread. But very soon, that bread shop was gone, and then you had a bread cart with some fancy name, and the bread was 10 times more. You know what I'm talking about. I still love Grand Central Market, but it's completely different from just a few years ago. Anyway, this was the Grand Central Market of Arturo Bandini and John Fante. Yes. Okay, let me read this. So I'm going to, what I have up here is just shorter passages, so I'm going to sometimes read fuller passages, so this is one of those. So Arturo is a racist and a victim of racism. You know how that can work. So here's what he says. Oh, for a Mexican girl. I used to think of her all the time. My Mexican girl. I didn't have one, but the streets were full of them. The plaza in Chinatown were afire with them, and in my fashion, they were mine. This one and that one, and someday, when another check came, it would be a fact that I'd have a Mexican girl. Meanwhile, it was free, and they were Aztec princesses and Mayan princesses, the peon girls in the Grand Central Market, the Church of Our Lady, and I even went to Mass to look at the Mexican girls. That was sacrilegious conduct, yes, but it was better than not going to Mass at all. So that when I wrote home to Colorado, to my mother, I could write with truth, Dear Mother, I went to Mass Sunday. Down in the Grand Central Market, I bumped into the princesses, accidentally on purpose. It gave me a chance to speak with them, and I smiled and said, excuse me. Those beautiful girls, so happy when you acted like a gentleman and all that. Just to touch them and carry the memory of it back to my room, where the dust gathered upon my typewriter, and Pedro the mouse sat in his hole, his black eyes watching me through that time of dream and reverie. Wow. Do you see the distance he went in that one paragraph, right? I mean, he's lusting after Mexican girls, then he's at Mass, and now Pedro's staring at him. But it's not contrived, right? It's crafted. It really paints a scene. It's absolutely amazing. It's so raw, so like you see right through his hubris to his pain and bullshit and just failure, ultimate failure. So here he is again. So you walk along Bunker Hill, and you shake your fist at the sky, and I know what you're thinking, Bandini, and this is where some of that self-loathing comes from. I know what you're thinking, Bandini. The thoughts of your father before you. Lash across your back, hot fire in your skull, that you are not to blame. This is your thought, that you were born poor, son of misery, peasants, driven because you were poor, fled from your Colorado town because you were poor, rambling the gutters of Los Angeles because you were poor, hoping to write a book to get rich because those who hated you back in Colorado will not hate you if you just write that book. You're a coward, Bandini, a traitor to your soul, a feeble liar before your weeping Christ. This is why you write. This is why it would be better if you died. So from hubris to self-loathing in a paragraph. This is one of the more brutal scenes where he and Camila Lopez have a fight, and he mocks her boots she's wearing that I guess were popular at the time, and he calls her a greaser. And this is, I think, somewhere on Wilshire. They're having this fight very publicly, and he's horrible, just horrible. He resorts to racism when he's afraid. I don't know if that's relevant anymore. He resorts to racism when he's afraid, and then he's got to hide that. He's got to pump himself up. Otherwise, he has to stare at his own shadow. What's not even his shadow, it's him. So after this fight on Wilshire, he's horrible to her. He says this: I tossed my shoulders and swaggered away, whistling with pleasure. No, you didn't. You're lying. In the gutter, I saw a long cigarette butt. I picked it up without shame. No, you didn't. You wouldn't have written that if you'd picked it up without shame, but okay. Lit it as I stood with one foot in the gutter. Yeah, nice image. Puffed it and exhaled toward the stars. I was an American and goddamn proud of it. No, you're not. You're an Italian immigrant from Colorado in 1930. This great city, these mighty pavements and proud buildings, they were the voice of my America. From sand and cactus, we Americans had carved an empire. Dude, you just got here. But okay. Camila's people had had their chance, did they? They had failed. How? We Americans had turned the trick. Thank God for my country. Thank God that I'd been born in America. So there's just in a brief passage there is racism at work in America, depicted more poignantly than I ever could in an academic sense. You know you can't become the dominant culture as much as you try. And you try. You really do try. You open a store, you pay your taxes, you're good neighbors, you vote, you do all the things you're supposed to do, but you won't ever get there. And at some points, especially vulnerable points, you realize you won't, and so you need someone to blame. And rather than blame your oppressor, you turn and blame someone who's oppressed with you. I don't know the sociology of this or the psychology of it, but you can see it over and over and over again. We talked a few weeks ago, I guess a few months ago, about Leslie Marmon Silko's ceremony, where a Laguna Pueblo man goes off to war. Men go off to World War II. When they're in the war, when they're in the army, they suddenly get treated like white men. And they're like, what just happened? So everybody's cool with them because why? Because we have a greater enemy, the Japs, right? And so once there's that object of racism, that object of oppression, I don't need to mess with you right now. I've got a bigger enemy. I've got a bigger other. But this is documented not only in the novel, but in other cases. So when they came back, when these native people came back, they went back to the old dichotomies, the old racial dichotomies of like, oh, you're just an Indian. But dude, we fought the Japs. Yeah, but not anymore. Now you're the other, again. This is what's happening here with Arturo. He loves Camila. He obviously loves her. She drives him insane. He can't stop her, stop loving her, or stop her for that matter. But he calls her a greaser? Come on, because she pissed him off, so you go there? Why would you go there? One of the things that gets lost in these discussions usually is class. And Fante is brilliant at this, because remember the other line I read you about poverty. Poverty shaped his life. And class, poverty and race, ethnicity, and gender, it all gets wrapped up together, but we forget sometimes to look at the effects of poverty. So this is what he said, Arturo Bandini. I went up to my room, up the dusty stairs of Bunker Hill, past the soot-covered frame buildings, along that dark street, sand and oil and grease choking the feudal palm trees standing like dying prisoners, chained to a little plot of ground with black pavement hiding their feet. The dust, you can already hear the dust references. Dust in old buildings and old people sitting at windows, old people tottering out of doors, old people moving painfully along the dark street. The old folk from Indiana and Iowa and Illinois, from Boston and Kansas City and Des Moines. They sold their homes and their stores. They came here by train and by automobile to the land of sunshine, to die in the sun, with just enough money to live until the sun killed them, tore themselves out by the roots in their last days, deserted the smug prosperity of Kansas City and Chicago and Peoria to find a place in the sun. And when they got here, they found that other and greater thieves had already taken their possession, that even the sun belonged to the others. Smith and Jones and Parker, druggist, banker, baker, dust of Chicago and Cincinnati and Cleveland on their shoes, doomed to die in the sun, a few dollars in the bank, enough to subscribe to the Los Angeles Times, enough to keep alive the illusion that this was paradise, that their little paper-mache homes were castles, the uprooted ones, the empty, sad folks, the old and the young folks, the folks from back home. These were my countrymen. These were the new Californians with their bright polo shirts and sunglasses. They were in paradise. They belonged. Again, same theme. He's talking about these people in the polo shirts, WASPs from Indiana, Iowa, and Illinois. I've seen them stagger out of their movie palaces and blink their eyes, their empty eyes, in the face of reality once more, and stagger home to read the Times, to find out what's going on in the world. I have vomited at their newspapers, read their literature, observed their customs, eaten their food, desired their women, gaped at their art, but I am poor, and my name ends with a soft vowel, and they hate me, and my father, and my father's father, and they would have my blood and put me down. But they are old now, dying in the sun and in the hot dust of the road, and I am young and full of hope and love for my country and my times. And when I say greaser to you, it's not my heart that speaks, but the quivering of an old wound, and I am ashamed of the terrible thing I have done. Tell me a character you can think of that is that naked to the reader. That naked. When I say greaser to you, it's not my heart. Of course it isn't. That's some craziness in your brain that's been put there that you've decided to act on. It's not my heart that speaks, but the quivering of an old wound. And I'm ashamed of the terrible thing I have done. I love this scene. This is, he's coming in to get a room at a different hotel. And the lady there is about to check him in. And he's got his suitcase full of the Atlantic Monthly and his clothes. And he announces himself as Arturo Bandini. She smiled with a smile that seemed to hurt her face. Cracking it open with old lines that broke up the dry flesh around her mouth and cheeks. You're an author? Yes, the little dog laughed. I hate dog stories, she said, putting the magazine out of sight. She looked at me from an even higher view over her glasses. Young man, are you a Mexican? I pointed at myself and laughed. Me? A Mexican? I shook my head. I'm an American, Mrs. Hargraves. And that isn't a dog story either. It's about a man. It's pretty good. There isn't even a dog in the whole story. We don't allow Mexicans at this hotel. I'm not Mexican. I got that title after the fable, you know, and the little dog laughed to see such sport. Nor Jews. I registered. I had a beautiful signature in those days, intricate, oriental, illegible, with a mighty slashing underscore, a signature more complex than that of the great J.C. Hackmuth. And after the signature, I wrote Boulder, Colorado. She examined the script word for word. What's your name, young man? And I was disappointed because she'd already forgotten the author of The Little Dog Who Laughed, and his name was printed in large type on the magazine, and I told her my name, and she printed it carefully over my signature. Then she crossed the page to the other writing. Mr. Bandini, Boulder is not in Colorado. It is too. I just came from there. I was there 2 days ago. Boulder is in Nebraska. My husband and I went through Boulder, Nebraska. My husband and I went through Boulder, Nebraska 30 years ago. On our way out here, you will kindly change that, if you please. But it is in Colorado. My mother lives there. My father. I went to school there. She reached under the desk and drew out the magazine. She handed it to me. This hotel is no place for you, young man. We have fine people here, honest people. I didn't accept the magazine back. I was so tired, hammered to bits by the long bus ride. All right, I said, all right, it's in Nebraska. And I wrote it down and scratched out Colorado and wrote Nebraska over it. She was satisfied, very pleased with me, smiled and examined the magazine. Oh, so you're an author. She said, how nice. And then she put the magazine out of sight again. Welcome to California. You're going to love it here. Brilliant scene, right? Just brilliant. And how painfully true for people who are not white. I mean, you have to do this kind of performance in many different ways. But you end up eventually having to say it's Boulder, Nebraska, because the dominant culture and the dominant mythology will not allow you to say otherwise. Oh, and when you do, you're gonna love it here because you acquiesce to my bullshit. Welcome. This is another woman. that he has a chance to be with, a Jew, as he puts it. She was so shy. Oh, it's a woman he meets, I think in a department store or something, and she's not a Camila Lopez. He's not drawn to her, but she's drawn to him, and he's like, oh, what do I do now? I don't know how to handle it. She was so shy all at once, so delighted. And I laughed to find the words coming easier now. And I told her again and again of her loveliness and how silly she had been to say she wasn't. But say it fast, Arturo, say it quickly, because something was coming up in me and I had to get out. So I told her I had to go down the hall for a minute for her to dress while I was gone. She undresses in front of him and he's like, whoa. She covered herself and her eyes were swimming in joy as she watched me leave. I went down to the end of the hall to the landing of the fire escape, and there I let go. Okay, the great Arturo, what does he do when he lets go? Crying and unable to stop because God was such a dirty crook, such a contemptible skunk. That's what he was doing for that thing to that woman. Come down out of the skies, you God. Come on down and I'll hammer your face all over the city of Los Angeles. You miserable, unpardonable prankster. If it wasn't for you, this woman would not be so maimed, and neither would the world. And if it wasn't for you, I could have had Camila Lopez down at the beach. But no, you have to play your trick. See what you have done to this woman? And to the love of Arturo Bandini for Camila Lopez. And then my tragedy seemed greater than the woman's, and so I forgot her. Again, there more of this plaintive cry. Then what shall I do? Shall I lift my mouth to the sky, stumbling and burbling with a tongue that is afraid? Shall I open my chest and beat it like a loud drum, seeking the attention of my Christ? Or is it not better and more reasonable that I cover myself and go on? There will be confusions. There will be hunger. There will be loneliness with only my tears like wet, consoling little birds, tumbling to sweeten my dry lips. But there shall be consolation, and there shall be beauty like the love of some dead girl. Okay? There shall be some laughter, a restrained laughter, and the quiet waiting in the night, and a soft fear of the night like the lavish, taunting kiss of death. Then it will be right. And the sweet oils from the shores of my sea poured upon my senses by the captains I deserted and the dreamy impetuousness of my youth. But I shall be forgiven for that and for other things. For Vera, the woman he was talking about, and for the ceaseless flapping of the wings of Voltaire, for pausing to listen and watch that fascinating bird. For all things there shall be forgiveness when I return to my homeland by the sea. City as redemption, right? We would never do that here to the city of angels. So there's an earthquake, because of course there is. Sorry. And he writes, Arturo writes, I got back to Los Angeles the next day. I don't know if you can relate to this feeling. The city was the same, but I was afraid. The streets lurked with danger. The tall buildings forming black canyons were traps to kill you when the earth began to shake. The pavement might open, the streetcars might topple. Something had happened to Arturo Bandini. The earthquake, after all he's been through, it's the earthquake that really messes him up. He walked the streets of one-story buildings. He clung to the curbstone, away from the overhanging neon signs. It was inside me deeply. I could not shake it. I saw men walking through deep, dark alleys. I marveled at their madness. I crossed Hill Street and breathed easier when I entered Pershing Square. No tall buildings in the square. The earth could shake, but no debris would crush you. Well, we would not know likely of John Fante without another great writer named Charles Bukowski. He says this in the 1983 edition of Ask the Dust. He writes the foreword, I was a young man starving and drinking and trying to be a writer. I did most of my reading at the downtown LA Public Library, and nothing that I read related to me or to the streets or to the people about me. It seemed as if everybody was playing word tricks, that those who said almost nothing at all were considered excellent writers. Their writing was an admixture of subtlety, craft, and form, and it was read, and it was taught, and it was ingested, and it was passed on. It was a comfortable contrivance, a very slick and careful word culture. One had to go back to the pre-revolution writers of Russia to find any gamble, any passion. There were exceptions, but those exceptions were so few that reading them was quickly done, and you were left staring at rows and rows of exceedingly dull books. With centuries to look back on with all their advantages, the moderns just weren't any good. I pulled book after book off the shelves, and I screamed, why didn't anybody say something? Why didn't anybody scream out? Then one day I pulled a book down and opened it, and there it was. I stood for a moment reading. Then, like a man who had found gold in the city dump, I carried the book to a table. The lines rolled easily across the page. There was a flow. Each line had its own energy and was followed by another like it. The very substance of each line gave the page a form, a feeling of something carved into it. And here at last was a man who was not afraid of emotion. The humor and the pain were intermixed with the superb simplicity. The beginning of that book was a wild and enormous miracle to me. And here is the story of how Ask the Dust is still in print.
Of the novel Women by Charles Bukowski, ready for publication. There was a very interesting little scene in the novel about Henry Chinaski, who is Charles Bukowski, reading in a bar in Hollywood, and afterward an English teacher came up to him with her class and asked for his autograph and to tell him that she thought he was one of the best writers in America. And Bukowski was pleased by that. And then she went on to ask him who his favorite writer was. And he said John Fante. And she'd never heard of John Fante, and neither had I. And she remarked that it would be strange that as an English teacher, she never would have heard of him. And Bukowski is rather curt with her about that, because she should know who he was. And later, after the book was published, a year or so, I was talking to Bukowski on the phone, and for some reason, thank goodness, I asked him about that scene, and I said, there's no such person, is there? And he said, of course there is. And I was really shocked, and it took me almost a year to get a copy of Ask the Dust. None of the libraries had it, no bookstores had it, it wasn't in print and hadn't been for 40 years. And I finally was able to get a Xerox copy of the book from the LA Public Library. And when I read it, I knew I had run across a classic. And at that time, Bukowski, and still to this day, but at that time, he was very big in Europe, in France and Germany and Italy. And so I asked him if he would write a preface to Ask the Dust, because I knew it would help with overseas sales, and I knew it would certainly help here in America. And then the book took off. I think that book was published around the early 80s, and in less than 20 years, I'm sure we've sold several 100,000 copies, and that many more in Europe in translation.
When he was rediscovered and began being republished by Black Sparrow Press, he was very happy. He, of course, was by that time a blind man and also a double amputee. But I took the new copy of Ask the Dust to him. He was in the motion picture hospital, and he held it in his hands, and I described it to him, and he was so happy. He couldn't have been happier.
Inexplicably, he pulled himself together for a period of time when he wrote Dreams from Bunker Hill. But I guess he had one more book to write. So he sat out here in the back with my mom and dictated it.
I think he composed in his head, and he had everything ready to put down on paper. Then he would dictate, and I had a legal tablet. Imagine it sitting in the patio now in the sunlight with the birds building their nests in the springtime. And he didn't hesitate very much when he dictated, because he had already gone over it in his mind. And I think in his own mind he was back in that period. He was a young man again, because it sounds like a book written by a young man.
So I was back again, back to L.A. with 2 suitcases and $17. I liked it. The sweep of blue skies, the sun in my face, the endearing streets, tempting, beckoning, the concrete and cobblestone, soft and comforting as old shoes. I rode on the trolley to the crest of Bunker Hill and looked at the hotel in the distance. It was magic, like a castle in a book of fairy tales.
Yeah, and that is a documentary called Sad Flower in the Sand. I want to show you another little piece of here at the end. But you should know that Bukowski did write a poem for his friend and mentor, John Fante, and it goes like this. Every now and then it comes back to me, him in bed there, blind, being slowly chopped away, the little bulldog. Nurses passing through, pulling at curtains, blinds, sheets, seeing if he was still alive. The Colorado Kid, the courage of the American Mercury, Minchin's Catholic bad boy, gone Hollywood, and tossed up on shore, being chopped away, chop, 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 until he was gone. He never knew he would be famous. I wonder if he would have given a damn. I think he would have. John, you're big time now. You've entered the books of forever, right there with Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, and your boy Sherwood Anderson. I told you, and you said you wouldn't shit an old blind man, would you? No need for that, bulldog. And then this is the ending of Sad Flower in the Sand that includes a reading of the last passage of Ask the Dust that I think is just really beautifully done.
Ask the dust on the road. Ask the Joshua trees standing alone where the Mojave begins. Ask them about Camila Lopez, and they will whisper her name. You will not believe that a girl would start across the Mojave Desert in October, but it happened. I saw Camila's footprints in the sand. Let these hills hide her. Let her live with stones and sky, with the wind blowing her hair to the end. Let her go that way. I made my way up to the path to the ford. In the seat was a copy of my book, my first book. I opened it to the flyleaf and wrote, "To Camilla, with love, Arturo." I carried the book 100 yards into the desolation. With all my might, I threw it far out in the direction she had gone. Then I got into my car, started the engine, and drove back to Los Angeles.
So, yes, he does finish his book. He has a book. He did it. Arturo Bandini came and wrote his book in Los Angeles. But he has no Camila. She's in the desert with Sammy. And then she leaves Sammy and just wanders off into the dust. And so, in a perfect ending to a brilliant novel, he signs his book to Camila and throws it into the desert. Thank you for your attention.